Hello, this is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Zachary, coming to you live from Algiers. The war between Russia and Ukraine passed the 100-day mark. For the people of Ukraine, the period since Russia launched its invasion has been torturous, cruel, and uncertain. More than 10% of Ukrainians have fled the country. We have also witnessed Russian advances on Kyiv and Kharkiv being thrown back by courageous battlefield tactics and strategic leadership. What's more to come on the ground as Russia is being unpredictable? And the very proof is Russia shelling to the outskirts capital after weeks of calm is a pressing concern, along with how effective are the sanctions against Russia and what will Russia do in retaliation. We will raise some of these concerns and other questions with our panel of guests. I'm joined live via Skype by Andy Hunter, President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine, along with Ambassador Georgi Badridze, Senior Fellow at Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. We go on a short break and we get down to discussion. So let's begin with what's on tap for today. Allegations of sexual violence and human trafficking by Russian troops in Ukraine are mounting as the conflict passes its 100-day mark. At a meeting of the Security Council, senior United Nations officials said women and children fleeing the conflict are being targeted for trafficking and exploitation. Let's listen.
In March, for predators and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy. It is an opportunity. Women and children fleeing the conflict are being targeted for trafficking and exploitation, in some cases facing further exposure to rape and other risks while seeking refuge.
And this is a strategy to establish control over communities. Russia is using sexual violence and rape as a terror to control civilians at the temporarily occupied territories.
There have been multiple reports from survivors of Russia's soldiers breaking down doors to basements where women were sheltering and raping them. These terrible acts were done in front of their children, and they were filmed by the Russian soldiers. These are bone-chilling accounts, and we know for every account we hear, many more are unknown.
Let me commence with you, Mr. Andy Hunter. The flow of false or misleading information about the war hasn't let up. And now there are many outlandish theories or has been exaggerated by the West in terms of its scale and such allegations of sexual assaults, war crimes, and so on. How do we verify these claims amidst all this false information? And how can we get to the bottom line of the truth amid the spread of this information war and fake news?
Well, thank you, Fareed. I think it's important to understand that we are over 100 days into this brutal war that Russia started, this illegal, unprovoked war. And together with the war, with the killing, the murder, we've seen the horrible cases of rape. As you say, Russian soldiers are raping women, children, men, raping women in front of their husbands, raping children in front of their parents. And this is a war crime. I think this is a war crime. It's the whole world is seeing this now. I think, we will have a tribunal as soon as possible to put those who are committing these atrocities and those who are guiding these atrocities. So they must face justice in the international courts. It's really, bone chilling as we see what is happening in 21st century Europe. We've seen already that Russians have taken out of Ukraine over 1 million Ukrainians by force. Over 200 children have been taken out. There is a genocide that is being committed by Russia against Ukraine in 21st century Europe. And I think it's just so important that all these atrocities are recorded. They are being recorded. And there's an independent judicial system that will then rule on the war crimes. I think we saw the war crimes after Hitler, what Hitler and his army did in the Second World War. And I think we're seeing the war crimes that Vladimir Putin and his war criminals are taking these atrocities in 21st century Europe. The difference here is that we have the technology, with mobile phones being able to fix these atrocities. I think the fact that some of the Russians themselves are filming these atrocities, these will be used against them in court. And I think it is justice. What Ukrainians are fighting for is their freedom, their independence and justice, standing up to for their sovereignty. And it's a horrible war. And the brutality of Russia, the Russian army, is being seen across the world. This must stop. This must stop as soon as possible.
Thank you indeed. Ambassador Georgi Badridze, the reason Russia engaged in what it called a special military operation is the Western betrayal of Russia by expanding NATO eastward after the end of the Cold War, ignoring Western security guarantees, and that NATO rules out future membership for Ukraine and other ex-Soviet republics. What's your interpretation here?
First of all, it's just, in a plain English, it's a lie. There were no guarantees that NATO would not admit willing members. What Russia refers to usually is James Baker's promise, private promise. It has never been turned into an agreement even, let alone treaty. Another fact is that it's not NATO that's been expanded, it's Russia's neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe that were desperate to join and gain security guarantees for Russia. And for a good reason, as we have seen. All new members of NATO are today protected. They do not pose any threat to Russia. And those three countries to Russia's southwest that weren't fortunate to join NATO have Russian occupation and wars. So I think Russia's argument that NATO betrayed some kind of promise is, number one, is a lie. And second, that NATO poses any military threat to Russia is very clearly non-starter. Strategic weapons, Russia's NATO military units have not been moved to the east after the Central and Eastern European countries joined. So there was no kind of disbalance in strategic terms. Russia has not faced any military threat after its neighbors chose to join NATO. They were not coerced. NATO was not expanding. Russia needs to ask itself why its neighbors are so desperate to seek for security guarantees. And guess what? Just recently, two traditional neutral countries have now decided that neutrality is not a guarantee for security, and they are also joining NATO. I mean, of course, Finland and Sweden. So Russia needs to ask itself why its neighbors feel so insecure that they seek alliances, they seek protection from someone else.
Very nice. Understood. Moving on, Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia stormed out of a UN Security Council meeting on Monday as European Council President Charles Michel addressed the 15-member body and accused Moscow of fueling a global food crisis with its invasion of Ukraine. Michel also accused Russian troops of war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically citing reports of sexual violence, the focus of the Security Council meeting.
Хотели бы еще раз категорически опровергнуть любые обвинения российских военнослужащих.
We hear reports of Russian forces wielding sexual violence as a weapon of war. Sexual violence is a war crime, a crime against humanity, a tactic of torture, terror, and repression, shameful acts in a shameful war. And this must be exposed to the light of day and prosecuted without impunity.
I would once again like to categorically refute any accusations against Russian service personnel of sexual violence. We roundly condemn this lie.
I get back to you, Mr. Andy Hunter. The war marks a geopolitical watershed. It will result in Russia's exclusion from the Western economic and political order. How long do you think these sanctions will remain in place, that is? And can Russia find in China and developing world the alternative?
Yeah, right. It is not only is it immoral, but it's illegal for companies to do business in Russia now. The US President Biden signed an executive order on April 6, prohibiting all new investments into Russia by the United States entities. So the companies understand that there is no future for business in Russia. The companies are leaving. Every day we see big companies that are leaving Russia. They're packing their bags. They're out of there. They do not want to be associated with a pariah regime in the Kremlin that is killing, raping, and murdering innocent civilians in 21st century Europe. So I think the issue there is there is no future for international business in Russia. The sanctions, we've seen the 6th package of sanctions coming across. They are biting. We are seeing that many of the oligarchs and many of those individuals close to the Kremlin are having their assets seized, their yachts seized, their properties. I think we will see changes in legislation for those assets to be sold, and for the money from the sold assets to go and rebuild the buildings that have been destroyed by Russians, rebuild the cities, the hospitals, the schools that the Russian army has inflicted on independent Ukraine. So the sanctions, they are there, they will continue. We are looking more now at still an oil embargo on Russia to really get that message across that, no country can have these atrocities and go away unpunished. And I think this is the way, a clear message the West is sending to Russia, that, there is no business future for any international companies in Russia. But more importantly, anybody associated with this pariah criminal regime will be punished. And I think that's the purpose of sanctions. And I think, the Russian economy, it will suffer. We will see a contraction of GDP in Russia for the Russian people to really understand what their leadership are doing in terms of starting and continuing this cruel, brutal, illegal war in 21st century Europe. They will be punished, and the people will also, until they stand up and say to Vladimir Putin, stop the war.
But Mr. Andy Hunter, with the sanctions persisting, the West will have to reorganize its global supply chains, including for commodities supplied by Russia. Ukraine and the wider region also will remain a zone of instability for many years to come. Well, how do you read this?
Well, Ukraine is the largest producer in the world of sunflower oil, sunflower seed. It's a massive producer of wheat, of corn. We see countries across the globe, across Northern Africa, they are very much reliant on Ukrainian soft commodities, on sunflower seed, on corn, on wheat. And Russia has blocked the ports. Until the ports are unblocked, and that is a clear message we are delivering, to unblock those ports. Russia is blocking with its naval ships the ports. It is creating a world food security issue. And 400 million people across Northern Africa, across Asia, are at risk of starvation because of Vladimir Putin and his war. So what we're saying is unblock those ports. Those ports need to be unblocked as soon as possible, demined, having a convoy to allow the ships to come out of the ports around Odessa, around Mykolaiv, through the Black Sea safely, through the Bosphorus, and then across to the global markets.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but Russia seemed to deny actually blocking the food, or the ships in the Ukraine's ports. And they are saying that the Ukrainians were the ones who mined the port. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, the Russians are denying this is a war. So I think it's really, the credibility of Russia. I think look at the facts themselves. We represent the companies that are operating. These are international global companies that have been operating in Ukraine for the last 30 years, exporting to countries across North Africa, across the globe, exporting sunflower, exporting wheat, exporting corn. And now clearly the Russians have stopped that. There is no one else that's stopping that except the Russian army and the Kremlin. So until that blockade is broken through, until the Russians allow the ships to leave the ports of Ukraine, of Odessa, of Mykolaiv, the 400 million people across the world are at risk of starvation.
Thank you so much. Mr. Gorgi, Ambassador Gorgi Badridzi, can we say that the West failed in dealing with the Russia-Ukraine file here? Because when we look at sanctions, for instance, we see that they exacerbated the already existing food crisis in the world.
First of all, I don't believe that it is international sanctions that caused the food crisis in the world. It's Russia's actions, it's Russian blockade of Ukraine, and its pillaging and destruction of Ukraine. Number one. Number two, yes, I wish we had much more robust and timely reaction on part of the international community, both legally through international organizations, because Russian aggression against Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law. Number two, the supplies to Ukraine of weapons to defend itself, they are essential. They have played very important role, but they have usually been delayed, and more needs to be done and more quickly. As for the long-term effects of the sanctions, well, they were never designed to change the outcome of specific battles. It's about preventing Russia from replenishing the tremendous losses of weapons, of armored vehicles, and other materials on the battlefield, and to make sure that Russia's ability to wage war is reduced in time, and then eventually Russia is simply loses the appetite to invade.
But Mr. Gorgi Badridzi, we see that the sanctions, were it not for the sanctions, the fuel prices would not have risen. And along with that, of course, so many important commodities that were perhaps shipped mainly to some poor countries like in Africa.
Well, like I said, it's not sanctions that prevent, for instance, Ukrainian wheat and sunflower oil and other products getting the Northern Africa and other countries. And we need to divide two things clearly. The sanctions on Russian exports, of course, they have played their role in international prices. Energy prices have jumped up, but this is a small price actually to pay for stopping this unimaginable tragedy and atrocities that Russia has inflicted not only upon Ukraine, but it's a direct attack on the rules-based international order. So international community had to react, and one of the ways to react on it is to reduce the flow of foreign currency into Russian coffers, which basically are used to wage war. A war that has never been provoked, a war that was completely unnecessary, and war that is the war of choice of Mr. Putin personally, whose main priority here was not Russia's security, but the security of his regime, which has been in place for 22 years. And he has very clearly demonstrated his inability to improve the quality of life of his countrymen while presiding over the government of one of the world's richest countries in terms of natural resources. And yet Russia remained a poor country in every possible economic sense. In 2021, Russia's GDP was barely 3% of the world GDP. Its GDP per capita was in 80s. And obviously there would be a question at some point, why Russia, that should be the richest country in the world, why is it so poor, and why is it ruled by the world's richest people? Right. I think this war is one of the ways to avoid such questions.
Okay, understood. Now, to have more info about what's happening on the ground, according to Ukrainian president, Russian forces outnumber them and have more advantage in the battlefield, but declared, that is Ukrainian president, that they will fight back. Let's follow the details in this report, then we get back to discussion.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russian forces outnumber them and have more advantage in the battle for the eastern city of Severodonetsk, but declared that Ukraine will fight back.
The situation in the east is difficult. You know the situation in Severodonetsk. The Russians are outnumbering us and are more powerful, but we are maintaining the situation.
The mayor of Severodonetsk confirmed that the situation was constantly changing and intense street fighting had been taking place. As the operation goes on, Russia's main focus has become the industrial city Severodonetsk in the Donbas region, while other towns are under constant shelling. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the railway infrastructure is in ruins after having been the target of several Russian airstrikes, the first since late April in the Ukrainian capital. Moscow says that its missiles destroyed T-72 tanks provided by Eastern European nations and other armored vehicles, while Ukrainian officials claim that the installations are just railway wagon maintenance facilities. The Ukrainian capital, encircled a few months ago by the Russian army, is largely regaining its life, and some satellite residents are reconstructing their homes.
Back to you, Mr. Andy Hunter. It seems that the battlefield is tense and Ukraine does need a lot of support. But it seems that Biden's deal for just 4 systems, or includes just 4 systems of missile, long-range missile systems, and it came also with strings attached. And it's not going to be implemented immediately. It means it's going to be like weeks away from being operational. And Biden has made it clear that he will not allow a catastrophic failure of Ukrainian defenses, but it is just as evident that he has concerns about the implications of catastrophic success, a rout of Russian forces with decisive help of Western weapons, bringing with it the danger of defeated Putin lashing out. In addition, the French President Emmanuel Macron admitted the fact that Western nations failed in dealing with Russia. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen Russia invading Ukraine. And Russia, appropriately, he underlines that they should not humiliate it. So, Ukrainian foreign minister, of course, for his side, said that saying such calls only humiliate France and any country taking a similar position. How do you read this overall?
Well, I see the analogies of the Second World War, and anybody saying then, don't humiliate Adolf Hitler. I think, we have to look at this in hindsight and in history. I think on the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine. They thought they would capture Kyiv in 3 days. They were a disaster. Their military was corrupt. They were not prepared, and the Ukrainians fought them off. Ukrainians defended Kyiv, and now there are no Russian soldiers anywhere near Kyiv, anywhere near Chernihiv. Unfortunately, the atrocities we've seen have been really horrible as the Russians were leaving, as they occupied satellite towns around Kyiv, like Bucha, like Irpin. That's where the rape and the murder took place. But the Ukrainian army has cleared them off from Kyiv, from Chernihiv, from Kharkiv. And the same is going to happen with places like Severodonetsk. So these are temporary occupied territories. The Ukrainian morale of the army is extremely high. The soldiers are fighting for their lands, for their families, for the future of their country. While the morale in the Russian army is low, it's a corrupt army where we're seeing that a lot of the armor and a lot of the sources have been stolen. And I think it's really now the temporary gains by the Russian army that they will be pushed back, like we've seen in Kyiv, in Bucha, in Chernihiv, in Kharkiv, Odessa. The plan was that Russia would attack Odessa in the first days of the war. Odessa has been defended phenomenally well. So yes, there have been a number of towns that have been taken over now with a big push from the Russians. But I believe that is a temporary issue. I'm sure the Ukrainian army, with its morale, with its fighting spirit, with its lion-hearted soldiers, and with the state-of-the-art technology coming in from America, coming in from the West, will defeat the Russian army. I think it's inevitable. I think this will happen. And it is rightly so. I think, the world has to stand on the side of truth. Mm-hmm. There is only one thing now. What is the truth? What Russia has done is illegal. It's immoral, invading an independent nation in 21st century Europe. And now it's really for the world to recognize and to bring the perpetrators to justice, to take them to court in for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and I think we will see the war crime courts and those responsible will have to pay for this.
Clear indeed. Ambassador Gorgi Badridze, it is expected that the war is going to be protracted as the issues at stake are existential and not susceptible to compromise. Western support will give Ukraine the means to keep fighting, but both sides will struggle to win a decisive victory. At the same time, it seems that the sanctions implemented against Russia are indeed backfiring on the West and the US in particular. Much social unrest is expected within Western countries. How do you read the West's response to this crisis? And is Ukraine a victim of its own government and the West here?
First of all, if I may, your question is directly related to your previous question about the West's responsibility with regard to Russia's actions. And if there's anything that the West can be blamed of is of a not very principled approach toward Russia when it first started showing its revisionist policies in the early 2000s, when Mr. Putin directly questioned the post-Cold War world order and started basically making steps in order to regain Russian imperial possessions. When he invaded Georgia in 2008, there was virtually no cause for him, including with the participation of the then French President, Monsieur Sarkozy, who basically leaned on Georgia to accept the outcome of the war and the Russian occupation. And it is indeed, to a certain degree, the Western responsibility that Putin thought that there would be no repercussions, that there would be no Western support to Ukraine, and that he would get away with taking this huge European country with little cost to Russia, both militarily and economically. This turned out to be a huge miscalculation, but to a certain degree, the West needs to ask itself whether they led Mr. Putin into believing that this was possible. Same way as Adolf Hitler, basically. I'm sorry for this crass kind of parallel, but why in the late 30s he believed that he could start waging war on the entire world and winning. Number one. Number two, if there's, again, I think it was the lesson learned that even such great power as Russia cannot be allowed to destroy the rules-based international order. It's not about geopolitical interests of the Western countries versus Russia. Okay. It's about the stability in the world. If powerful countries start taking the territory of other countries, imagine the world in 10 years or 20 years. It's going to be a complete breakdown of the world order. So, yes, Russia needs to see that its whimsical policy of its leader has a price, that it cannot achieve its revisionist goals, imperialist goals, and we're talking about pure classical imperialism. Right?
So here, Ambassador Gorgi, can we say that there is a much more serious global conflict according to you here?
It is a serious global conflict. It is the new Cold War in its classical shape. The new Cold War that was relaunched by Russia, not by the West. The West never questioned Russia's borders. The West never questions Russia's legitimate security interests anywhere. Giving security guarantees to Russia's neighbors is not infringement of Russia's security. I'm sorry. It's about protecting them from Russia's imperialist attitudes and actions.
Understood.
So here we are in the new Cold War, and in this new Cold War, the West needs to be consistent. A policy of containment needs to be very much in place.
Very nice indeed. Let me just address this final question to Mr. Andy Hunder, since we're going to wrap it up. The longer the war drags on, the greater the risk of the West being pulled in, either as a result of a military miscalculation by either side or of the war accidentally spilling over into NATO member state. How do you see this? How potentially is this?
Well, this is, again, the Kremlin, the war it started, in order to stop any potential escalation, I think the West has to really stand up, provide Ukraine more arms to defend not only Ukraine, but to defend Europe and to defend the food security. The risk what Vladimir Putin is doing, putting 400 million people at risk of starvation in 21st century Europe by blocking the ports out of Ukraine, by blocking the wheat, the corn, the sunflower. I mean, these are criminal acts. And I think it is really understanding that these are criminal acts. What Russia is doing, what the Russian army is doing is criminal acts. There will be a war crime tribunal. I believe that this will happen soon. And Russia will pay. Russia will pay for the damages it has committed on Ukraine. And it'll be the Russian population will pay. And I think the sooner the war ends, that Ukraine comes out victorious, the better. And I think this is important not only for Ukraine, it's not only important for Europe, but it's important for the whole world, especially in the food security, to stop Vladimir Putin. Because otherwise, if he continues through Ukraine, any other country is at risk. So it's really now to stop Vladimir Putin, to stop the war, and to really get Ukrainians, Europeans, and the whole world back the food security and giving peace and prosperity.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that perhaps the West can provoke Vladimir Putin further here, especially by supplying weapons?
I think the West will supply more weapons. I think it's the right thing to do. I think, Ukrainians have shown real bravery. Be brave like Ukrainians in terms of standing up to this pariah state. When everyone said the might of the Russian army, it's proven not to be the case. Russia, it didn't capture places like Kyiv, Chernihiv.
Understood, Mr. Andy Hunders. Since we have reached the limit of our show, thank you so much for these clarifications. Mr. Gorgi Badrizi, thank you so much. Perhaps on next episode, we're going to give you further time. That's the end of our special coverage, dear viewers. Thank you for keeping it here on All 24 News. It's the end. Bye for now.